the Whole Woman Rated R podcast. I am your hostess, Shamika Shaw. I am the owner of the Whole Woman LLC, and I am a holistic pregnancy and postpartum practitioner. I am a mom of three. I also am neurodivergent, and also are my kiddos. I am a registered nurse. I've been specializing in labor and delivery. For the last 12 years, I am a doula and childbirth educator, along with many other hats. It is my love to be able to help women not only birth babies, but a more healed and thriving version of themselves in that process through education, empowerment, and encouragement. So, on today's podcast, we are going to talk about forget the hype. Are you ripe for labor and birth? So, what does that exactly mean? So, when we think about the word hype, that is something that is actually, it's very extravagant. It's a lot of publicity and promotion. But sometimes it can be done in a deceptive way, but not always. It also means to stimulate or excite. When we're hype about something, we're really excited about it. And there can be a lot of hype when it comes to the pregnancy and birth process. We do have a lot more information that we have readily available to us through different means. And it's something that we have been doing for many, many years as women. But I don't want you just to be hype about childbirth. I want you to really be ripe. So, what does ripe look like? What does ripe mean? Well, as you'll come to know, that I love acronyms. But before we get into what that means in an acronym, the word ripe itself means to really be developed and fully to the point of readiness. Um, it's ready for harvesting and ready to eat. If when we're talking about a ripe fruit, I actually have a physician that I've worked with, and I love the analogy that he actually sometimes will give to patients when we're talking about the induction process. And he talks about it's a lot easier to peel a ripe banana than an unripe banana, and so. We want to make sure that we are ripe in this process. It can mean soft, it can mean mature, fully grown. So, when I'm thinking about the word ripe and when it comes to the labor and birth process, for me, that looks like having readiness for revelation. That's revelation to not only educate yourself in this process of pregnancy and birth and postpartum and all that entails, but it's also revelation and an understanding of self-awareness in the process. The I in RIPE stands for intentionality. Intentionality, there is a lot of preparation that's involved in this, if you will allow yourself to prepare, but not just the preparation in the process, but also implementing those things that you've learned. I can tell you myself as someone who was a late diagnosed ADHD. It's something that I struggle with kind of throughout, I guess you can say, my life. Time management had been a struggle for me and something that I'm still working through and learning tips to help me navigate this journey as well. But I can tell people all the time, I'm an avid learner and love learning all different types of things and tips and tricks and all the things. But I can tell you sometimes just because we know better doesn't always mean that we do better. And there are things that I am still having to learn how to implement and be disciplined in, just because I know how to do them and understand the rationale behind them. So, as I speak and we share these things, as I told you in this process, we're growing together. I'm here to share some insight and wisdom, but know that once again, the whole woman is not a perfect woman. So we're always in a growth. And that actually leads us into the next letter, the P, and understanding that labor and birth is a process, just like anything else. And the E is for expectations. So, when we first think about the labor and birth process, actually recently had someone that I came across and it was a second child for her and wanting to do the birth process in a natural way. And when I asked if she had taken any childbirth classes, her response was no. But she said and followed up immediately and said that, that she was a woman, this was a natural process, so that she would be okay not having had any education and trying to do it a natural way the second time versus the first time when she had an epidural. And, I did the same thing, but I actually did not take a childbirth class until I was pregnant with my last child, Josiah. He was my fourth pregnancy and third birth. I had a miscarriage with my first, and I actually was a labor nurse for about a decade when I found out I was pregnant with him. As I said, I had two older children at the time, a teen and preteen, and I decided to have a home birth. There were things that I saw that I didn't always agree with that stood out to me in my years of being a labor nurse when I got pregnant with Josiah. But I decided and really felt this unction to have a home birth with him. And in that process, I decided to go ahead and take the childbirth education that was offered at the birth center that I was going to for my prenatal care. And I can tell you that I learned so much more about the birth process and the physiological process of birth, even with all the background that I had as a nurse and even being a mother and a woman. But, and I am a firm believer that sometimes we don't even know what we don't know. As a labor nurse, I can say that. Um, I really am grateful for the experience that I had up until that point, but I learned that in a lot of times, or from my experiences, there's a lot of emphasis that's placed on emergency situations, the medication administration, and things of that nature. Monitoring the baby's heart rhythm through our fetal heart monitoring system and really keeping a close eye on things, but not so much on that physiological aspect of the birth process. And so I would say, as a woman, even with all the background that I have and experience, it's important for us because as women, we have not always been taught about our bodies, in school. You take anatomy and physiology and may take a health class in high school or so, but we really do not fully understand how our bodies operate and how the birth process operates. Um, and so this is something that is very much needed, and I encourage you to seek out that information. Like I said, there are a lot of forms of ways that you can take in that information and get educated, whether it is through private childbirth education or a class at the local hospital. Or health department that you have. There is a lot of information online and social media. I actually know that, sometimes some of the personnel, I'll say, in the medical community, sometimes is a little has negative thoughts when it comes to things that are shared on social media because not all of it is correct information. But it's not to say that you can't get good information. And so I would implore you to make sure whatever information or sources that you are receiving your childbirth education information from, that it is valid, it is evidence-based information, and that it is a well-rounded approach. Sometimes we can look at things from a very skewed point of view when we're going into this process, and that goes on both ends as providers and as women who are going into the birth process, whether you want it to be an all natural process or you want all the medical interventions and all the things, and you're okay with that. But just make sure that you are looking into things that are evidence-based and that is really gives you a full perspective of everything that is involved in that process. Another thing that I want you to remember to be ripe in that revelation aspect is that understanding in that self-awareness part of it. In pregnancy, labor, birth, it will uncover some things and it will make us more aware of ourselves. Remember, it is something that will allow us to understand and our need to understand how do we do when we're under pressure. Pregnancy. Well, I'll say that labor and birth can be very intense. I'm not here to scare women because we don't want to cause all of this fear mongering when it comes to the birth process, but know that it is a very intense process nonetheless. Everyone's perception of pain can be a little different, but just understanding that it is very intense either way, and that those things that we do, how we react in stressful situations, will be sometimes the ways that we are going to react in this labor and birth process. And it's important that if they aren't healthy ways, that we know how to cope and to ground ourselves, that we are able to learn how to shift and adapt and evolve and grow, and learning those things as well in the process. So, it will maybe bring up fears, and we know that we don't want to be fearful. If we think about oxytocin is one of the hormones that is involved in the labor and birth process, and it's called the love hormone. Where did those fears come from that you may have in this process? What have you been told about the childbirth experiences? Are what you're hearing very negative? Is it positive? Um, in this process. And that Bible verse, when we look at 1 John 4:18, it says, "There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear, because fear involves torment. But he who fears has not been made perfect in love." And so, once again, we want to know that even though this process is a very intense process, it is a process of love, even in all the intensity and pressure that is involved in it. And as we move forward and we look at the I in ripe, that I is intentionality. Once you have that knowledge and revelation, what are you going to do with it? You have to be intentional about it. There's some steps that you may have to take, decisions that you have to make. Once again, just because sometimes we know better doesn't always mean that we do better. So we actually have to do something with all of this information that we have. And so that it helps us in this process of labor and birth. Also, once again, I talked about it being a process, and understanding that there are steps that's involved in it. But even with it being a process, there's some unpredictability that's involved. And I can kind of give you it's two sayings that I kind of stick with me. And one of them is by my apostle. And he had mentioned in service one day that, labor and birth is one of the most unpredictable things that a woman can endure and go through. And that is very true. There are many variables that's involved in this, but it is a process nonetheless. There are steps that is involved when a woman goes into early labor and active labor. It might be a different process, whether she is being induced versus going into labor on her own, or if there's anything that is involved that may have to have her make some alternate decisions. But it is a process. And the other quote I will say or saying actually was by a midwife that I worked with. And after I actually was with her as a patient, she delivered my daughter Victoria 17 years ago. And I remember her telling a patient, because sometimes women are afraid to, have a bowel movement when they are pushing and birthing that baby out. And, even going through that process of being uncomfortable with those contractions at times. But she told the patient, they don't call it labor for nothing and shit happens. So it was something that when she said it, we kind of chuckled about it, and it helped relieve some of the anxiety and the pressure that that young lady was feeling at the moment. But to understand that sometimes that intensity of the process, it's not always a quick process, but one that we will go through and walk through, and making sure that we have the things, the people in place that help us to go through that process, and that we've taken those steps to ready ourselves so that we are ripe for the process. We have educated ourselves. We have become more self-aware in this process of our pregnancy journey, leading up to it, and that we've taken intentional steps as well. One thing that I do like to educate women about, also I mentioned about, it's going to be a different outlook if a woman's coming in for, say, an induction process versus if her body goes into labor naturally. And there's lots of reasons why a woman may need to be induced. But in that process, I would tell women, because sometimes they didn't understand that the day that they were scheduled to come in for an induction, they automatically thought that that was the day that they were going to give birth, and not knowing that in the labor process, sometimes the body is doing things over the course of the last couple of weeks. Um, in preparation and preparing her body for the labor process. So when we are inducing someone, ultimately, we are trying to get that body to do something in a matter of a day or a couple of days that it may have taken 2 to 3 weeks or so to be doing little by little over that process. And so that she isn't discouraged if she doesn't have her baby within that first 24 hours of coming in for an induction process. But once again, this is a part of being ripe and not just hype for labor, not just hype coming in and saying, hey, I got my induction date. This is the date that I'm going to have my baby. But just knowing, and even if it is a natural labor process, that once again, it is a process, between that early labor phases, the active phases, transition phases, and it can look different from woman to woman. And even within the same woman herself, that process looks very different. I can tell you my experience, my first and third labors at Victoria and Josiah were somewhat similar. I gave birth 6 hours after my water broke. And with my second labor, it was a very long with Sheldon, who we affectionately call Tiger. It was a longer process with him, and he was my second. And it's something to understand that it is all different. You'll hear that first time babies take a long time. And on average, that might be the case, but it's not 100% across the board. And just knowing that it's great when you are hearing all the advice and tips from everyone else, because we love to share our experiences when we've had a child. And I tell people when I'm teaching childbirth classes all the time, take kind of what works for you, but just know that if your experience does not look like the next person's, it's not supposed to. It is yours to have. It is a very special and unique time. And then when we round that out with all the preparation, the educating ourselves, the understanding ourselves better, the being intentional, the understanding the process of it all, we then still have to manage our expectations, because once again, it can be a very unpredictable process, but we still want to take those steps to be intentional so that we are guiding ourselves and our thoughts towards what we want to put into place, but just understanding that there can be some shifts that need to be made, and that we are able to manage those expectations so that we aren't disappointed, and that we are able to pivot if we need to pivot quickly in the labor and birth process. And so, because we have educated ourselves along that way, we are able to pivot and not and to do it in a way that we're still advocating for the things that we want as a woman in this process, and to understand all that's involved, and not to feel bad about those things, and to be able to speak up and advocate ourselves in this journey as well. So, Mom, if you are expecting, hoping to become pregnant in this journey, wherever you are, remember, it's not just being hype about the labor and birth process, but really about truly being ripe and ready, fully mature for this process as well, so that it is that much more enjoyable of an experience for you. And I am so glad that you joined me on this episode, and I look forward and follow along. I am excited to announce a new product that I will be releasing very soon here called BirthFlex. And it's a toolkit to provide women with an opportunity not only to help them in their preparing to create a birth plan, but also learning how to be fierce and flexible in the process as well so that they can experience the birth of their dreams no matter where they choose to birth. So thank you for joining me once again here on the Whole Woman Rated R. I am your host, Shamika Shaw. Follow along for more, and you can always find out more information at www.thewholewoman.com. And I look forward to seeing you the next episode.